The Israeli government has long forbidden Jews to pray on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a place that is sacred to both Jews and Muslims. Yet a rabbi by the name of Yehuda Glick has been praying there in recent months and is not making much of an effort to hide his prayers. In fact, he's been live streaming them. He recently filmed himself with his phone as he prayed on the Temple Mount early one morning. Since Israel captured the old city of Jerusalem from Jordan in 1967, it's maintained a fragile religious balance at the Temple Mount, which is the most divisive site in Jerusalem. Until now, only Muslims were allowed to worship there, while Jews can pray at the Western Wall, or what they call the Wailing Wall. The Dome of the Rock is the third holiest site for Muslims after Mecca and Medina, but things are slowly changing, and we have to wonder if this is going to lead the Jews to call for the construction of their own place of worship on this site or near it, which could begin the building of a third temple. Remember, the first temple was built by Solomon around 3,000 years ago, and then it was rebuilt roughly 2,500 years ago when the Jews returned from captivity before it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And in 691 AD, the Dome of the Rock, which is an Islamic shrine, was built, and then around 700 AD, the Muslims built the Al-Aqsa Mosque, occupying the same site that Solomon's temple was located on. The Dome of the Rock is a shrine that Muslims believe to be the very place where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven, and the Jews believe that the Dome of the Rock sits in the exact location where Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, Isaac, before he was stopped by the angel. So to put things in perspective here, this location is a very holy and sacred place for both the Jews and the Muslims. Over the past several months, the Israeli government has quietly allowed an increasing number of Jews to pray there, a change in policy that could aggravate the instability in East Jerusalem and potentially lead to religious conflict and another upscale in the fighting like we've seen in the past between the Jews and the Palestinians. A former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, said that the Temple Mount is a sensitive place, and sensitive places such as this have an enormous potential for explosion and need to be treated with care. Rabbi Glick, on the other hand, who is an American-born, right-wing former lawmaker, has been leading efforts to change the status quo on the Temple Mount for decades. He says that his effort to pray there is a matter of religious freedom. He said, if the Muslims can pray there, why not the Jews? But the prohibition of Jewish prayer on this 37-acre plateau that once held the two Jewish temples has been part of a long-standing compromise to avoid conflict between the Palestinians and the Jews. Under that agreement, which has pretty much been followed for the past 50 years, the Jordanian government has retained administrative oversight of the Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Golden Dome of the Rock Shrine are located. Israel officially allows non-Muslims to visit the site for several hours each morning on the condition that they don't pray there. There's no actual Israeli law that forbids Jewish prayer there, but in years past, Jewish visitors who attempted to pray there have been removed by the police. That all now seems to be changing, and if it does, it could lead to more violence. So why are we so interested in what's happening on the Temple Mount and how it might affect the future? For two reasons. Number one, because this situation could lead to another uprising and fighting between the Jews and Palestinians. And number two, there are prophecies about the building of a third temple in Jerusalem, either on the Temple Mount or very near to it, which according to Bible prophecy, which will mean that we are in the last days. Some Jewish activists have even prepared a stone altar nearby ready for installation on the mount as soon as it becomes politically feasible to move it there. Their group, the Temple Institute, has also worked with architects to design a floor plan for the new Jewish temple. Here are a few prophetic verses talking about a future temple. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, it says, "And he, which many Bible scholars believe is the Antichrist, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, which represents 7 years. And in the midst of the week, in the middle of that 7-year period, he, the Antichrist, shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease." Well, you have to have a temple to have sacrifices. And then in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, it says, "And arms shall stand on his part," on the Antichrist part, "and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength and shall take away the daily sacrifice. So there must have been a temple there if there were daily sacrifices. And finally, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, when you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Many Bible scholars believe that the holy place Jesus was talking about is this coming third temple. And I'd like to ask Peter, does it look like we are getting close to the building of a third temple on the Temple Mount or near the Temple Mount, with all of the activity and the Jews trying to pray in that area right now?
Well, from the story that you read here, it sounds like for the first time in modern history, Jews are being allowed to pray on the site. Now, that could be as far as it goes, and I have to agree with, at least partly with what Rabbi Glick says, that it makes sense that Jews be allowed to pray on that site. As far as building a temple, that seems like that would be quite a significant thing that the government would have to get fully behind in order to make it happen, especially if it's going to be located on the Temple Mount area. And I at least haven't seen anything indicating that the government is interested in that, or that there is a significant movement within the government to make that happen.
I guess just as recently as this past spring, just some months ago, this very year, there was a pretty big fighting going on between the Palestinians, Hamas in the West Bank, on the Gaza Strip rather, and the Israelis, the rockets going back and forth. And that all started right there from an incident that happened in the Temple Mount, where the speakers on some of the minarets around the Al-Aqsa Mosque were cut. So that a speech could be given by Jewish politicians down the street from there. So
right, so
it just takes little things like that to spark the whole situation.
It seems the Israeli government is becoming more and more tolerant towards is becoming more and more tolerant to rethinking the use of that area, and perhaps not as agreeable to the Jordanian and Palestinian authorities as they used to be. I have to totally agree with what Ehud Olmert says, that you got to be really careful with this. You know, the view that the Israeli government takes has to be long-term, towards long-term peace, long-term coexistence, and playing around with something like this seems very foolish. Now, I hope that it doesn't go anywhere. I know that we tend to make a big deal out of things that maybe aren't such a big deal. It's kind of how the news works. You know, we're always looking for the next big thing to happen. Maybe this goes nowhere. I know at least that Israel is now on good terms with Jordan, with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with Russia. A lot of the powers that in the past we might have thought of as being opposed towards Israel are now on good terms with Israel. Do you think that the long-term outlook towards peace looks better than before, or is it still fragile?
It's interesting because when Netanyahu was voted out of office at their recent elections, and the new prime minister of Israel was even more to the right than Netanyahu, he made a few statements indicating that they might allow more Jews to go into the Mount area and pray. The very next day, the Jordanian government came out with some statements rebuking the Israeli government for even thinking that, and then the prime minister stepped back and they kind of settled things back to where they are right now. So I think it's a very fragile situation between the Palestinians and the Jews. I think if we could get the extreme elements a bit more out of the picture, the moderates from each party, from the Palestinians and the Jews, possibly could make the whole situation there much more peaceful than it is today. Between the countries like Jordan and Israel, I think there's relative peace. I think between Israel and Egypt, and now Israel and Saudi Arabia, I think slowly the situation seems like it is calming down, but that's between the moderates, not between the extremes.
Right.
So as these extreme elements take more control of different governments, then we see things escalate, and as the moderates seem to take more control, then things seem to simmer down.
Sure. I think another possibly positive event that's happening there is, recently the United States has been showing less of a military interest in the Arabian Peninsula. And what that has led to is that now a number of the powers in that area, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran, traditional rivals, are starting to look towards cooperation and peace. And it brings up the interesting topic of how de-escalating a situation can lead to more cooperation from the countries there. We know that the United States is the global superpower. So I think it's a positive development when the superpower pulls its forces from an area and the countries there then have to figure things out. And if we see any kind of cooperation between the Arab nations and Iran, that is one of the final de-escalations in that region that could really lead to a stabilizing peace in that area.
2 points that are interesting, that the Temple Mount, all those many acres, they could easily say, here's 5 acres for you guys to build your temple, or here are 6 acres for you to 7 to build your temple. They could allow that, and then maybe both parties would have peace, and plus there would be a third temple. If it's as it stands right now, and if Israel tried to build a temple in the Temple Mount, it could mean all-out war between the Palestinians at the very least and the Jews, and even some of the other, since that's such a sacred site in the eyes of the Muslims, it could break out. It's a very delicate situation. As long as everybody kind of holds the status quo, things seem to be just fine. But if anybody breaks out of the mold, all hell could break loose.
So you mentioned about the idea of a temple taking a part in end-time events. Is this something that Christians have always believed, or is this particular to certain branches of Christianity?
The discussion of Bible prophecy, I think, has really become much more mainstream, say since the 70s and 80s, when people were actually studying their Bibles more. Before that time, we have the traditional churches, like someone was a Presbyterian or a Catholic or a Lutheran or a Baptist, and they would read, sing their psalms or their songs at church, but not really be that interested in Bible prophecy. Nobody talked about it too much. But with the evangelical movement, which really took a hold in the 70s in this country and worldwide, people have been reading their Bibles more, and therefore they're reading more about Bible prophecy. And I think you have a real resurgence of Bible scholars that want to talk about these prophecies in the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, and in these other key prophecies like Matthew chapter 24, Luke chapter 21, 2 Thessalonians. It's really come into the conversation a lot more in the last 50 years.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting, the idea that state of Israel leads to a temple, and that we are looking at the possibility of a temple that will play a role in end-time events. Now, I look at the same texts, and I don't see a need for a temple to be rebuilt. We see a lot of places,
because it doesn't specifically say temple. It just talks about a sacrifice.
Well, we hear about a sacrifice. We do hear about a holy place. Paul talks about a temple, but then in 1 Corinthians, Paul specifically says that the temple is the church. Jesus talks about a temple being rebuilt, talking about his own body. So there does seem to be a lot of kind of talk around the issue, and I think it's not unrealistic to say, that there could end up being a temple there. But then there are other things that it talks about that we don't think, we have to build this thing for it to happen. We don't have to build a bottomless pit. There's some things that Christians just kind of read and say, okay, we'll see what happens. But then the temple, at least certain elements of Christianity seem to think, we have to make that happen. Do you think it's a legitimate idea that Christians working with Jews could make this temple happen and therefore bring along the end-time events?
I think it's possible that could happen. The mainstream thought on the subject of a temple is that there will be a third temple, but maybe it's just the altar. Maybe the altar that this institute has already constructed is enough to start the sacrifice. Maybe there doesn't have to be a big building. It could be a smaller venue and represent a big spiritual sacrifice for the Jews, or or whatnot. It's an interesting, it's an interesting subject,
Yeah.
and there is a lot of speculation. I would like to remind our viewers that when we speculate about these things, that's what it is, speculation. If it doesn't specifically say in the Bible this and that, then we cannot also specifically say it's going to be that way. But we can look at where the signs of the times that Jesus said. We can look at the political parties or the powers that be and see if they do play in to these prophecies. I think it's always dangerous to say, there's a prophecy here and I'm going to make sure it gets fulfilled, and therefore I'm going to do what that verse says and that prophecy is going to come to pass.
That kind of bothers
dangerous.
me. Yeah, that idea seems a little bit off. I mean, I have no problem with taking all of it completely literally. I think that's the best way to read the Bible is completely literally. If it says sacrifice, that means sacrifice. It says altar, that means altar. Now, there's also scholars who say, and not just scholars say it, but you read it and you see that a lot of what Jesus is talking about, he is very concerned and interested, and he talks a lot about the fall of Jerusalem and the events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem. How do we draw the line between fall of Jerusalem
and 70 AD?
Yeah, how do we draw the line between a fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and a future series of events around Jerusalem? How do we know that, well, here he's talking about this and here he's talking about that, when he seems to talk about all of it kind of in the same sermon?
Well, I think the answer to that question is a study of Matthew chapter 24, which we will be happy to do at another time and kind of go through that step by step, because Matthew 24 and Luke chapter 21 are very key chapters as it relates to Bible prophecy, and some of that, it seems like he's obviously talking about the fall of Jerusalem and what happened in 70 AD when the Romans came in and took the temple down and destroyed. And by the way, why did the Jews allow the Dome of the Rock and this mosque to be built in Jerusalem?
Well, unfortunately, there weren't very many Jews there at that time. You know, of course, we know that Jews have suffered a lot through history. Now, I don't know all the politics in the city of Jerusalem at that time. I know there was a Jewish population. I don't know how...
Very small, about 10%.
Right. And they had suffered tremendously at the hands of the Romans and later the Eastern Roman Empire. And I don't know for sure, but they might have not been too upset when the Muslims took control of Jerusalem. Now, you ask, why did they let them build the mosque? It seems like
they weren't there.
They didn't have, there weren't very many people there, and they didn't have any say. Of course, the Muslims were the conquerors. They took Jerusalem. They did what they wanted with it. Now we know that,
and that very fact, by the way, leads us to where we are today, and the fact that why are you Jews trying to come back here? You were gone for 2,000 years. Now you're calling this your land again, and the whole establishment of the modern day nation of Israel. And the return of the Jews from all over the world.
Sure. Well, the facts on the ground are quite different than they were back then. The Jews have now been a majority for decades, and I hope that they have their rights respected. It's not as if history stopped and we can't ever change things. So maybe there will be some kind of agreement where they can do their prayers, they can have their temple. Of course, as Christians, we hope that everyone comes to Jesus. I don't see a religious need for a temple, but it's their culture. Hey, maybe they can have it, and good for them if they can.
Which brings us back to our opening statement when we talked about what's happening on the Temple Mount right now, and more Jews going into that area and praying, which has not been allowed for about 50 years. So it'll be interesting to see how these things develop. And are we moving into the last days? We want to be aware of the signs of the times, and these little things that happen sometimes big explosions take place from little incidents that happen. One person gets killed and a war starts, and few people start praying where they hadn't been praying, and the whole situation erupts again. We'd like to know if you have any thoughts on what's happening in Israel right now and the Jews. You think they should be allowed to pray in the Temple Mount, even though it hasn't been allowed for the last 50 years? What are your thoughts on this? And we'd like to hear your comments below, if you have any comments on what we've said here. Thank you for watching, and please go ahead and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already done that, so you won't miss a beat on what we share here.